The evening started like so many others, with Amanda bustling around the house, arranging flowers, tweaking the lighting, and obsessing over every tiny detail. She loved hosting parties, always had. It was her way of showing off, whether it was our immaculate home, her carefully curated menu, or her group of equally polished friends. I'd gotten used to playing the silent supporting role in these events, stepping aside so Amanda could shine. "Daniel, can you set the wine glasses on the dining table?" she called out from the kitchen. "Sure," I replied, grabbing the delicate crystal glasses from the cabinet. It wasn't much of a request, but it was always something. Amanda loved her parties to run flawlessly, and I'd learned long ago that pushing back was pointless. These gatherings weren't for me. They were for her and her image. As I placed the glasses neatly on the table, I glanced at the framed photos on the wall. Smiling faces stared back at me. Our wedding day, a trip to the coast, Amanda posing in front of a vineyard. They felt like memories from a different life, one where we were still partners, where Amanda still saw me as someone she loved and respected. Lately, that connection had felt absent. And tonight, I was reminded just how far apart we had grown. The doorbell rang, jolting me from my thoughts. Amanda's voice floated down the hall. "Can you get that? I'm still finishing the hors d'oeuvres." I opened the door to find Sophia, the first of Amanda's friends to arrive. Sophia was always the loudest in the room, her laughter carrying over everyone else's. Tonight was no different. She swept past me without waiting for an invitation, her floral perfume leaving a trail in her wake. "Daniel, looking as serious as ever," she said with a teasing grin. "Lighten up, it's a party." Before I could respond, she was already heading toward Amanda in the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The two of them exchanged air kisses and launched into a rapid-fire conversation about something insignificant but, to them, clearly riveting. Over the next hour, the house filled with Amanda's friends, Rachel, Claire, and Vanessa. All of them perfectly dressed, perfectly poised, and perfectly ready to dominate the evening. The laughter started almost immediately, a cascade of high-pitched giggles that echoed through the house. I stayed on the edges of the gathering, offering drinks and replenishing snacks like the dutiful husband I was expected to be. "Daniel," Amanda called from the living room, a glass of wine in her hand and a smirk on her lips. "Come join us for a bit. Don't just stand there like a waiter." Her words stung more than I cared to admit, but I forced a smile and stepped into the circle of women. As soon as I sat down, I could feel the energy shift. The casual chatter took on a sharper edge, and the laughter grew louder, too loud. It was like a spotlight had been turned on me, and I was the unprepared act in their comedy routine. It started small, with Rachel commenting on my shirt. "Daniel, do you always wear the same thing? I swear I've seen that shirt every time I've been here." "Consistency is key," I said lightly, trying to deflect. "Oh, come on," Sophia chimed in. "It's a party, not a board meeting. Live a little." The group erupted in laughter, and Amanda didn't hesitate to join in. I tried to laugh it off, but the cracks were starting to show. They weren't just teasing. They were mocking me. And Amanda, my wife, was right there with them, leading the charge. As the evening wore on, the comments grew bolder. They joked about my job, how boring it must be to sit at a desk all day. They joked about my lack of social media presence, calling me a dinosaur. And when Amanda shared an embarrassing story about me from years ago, a story I had trusted her with, I felt the last shred of my dignity slipping away. Sophia leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine. "Amanda, I don't know how you manage. Daniel's so serious. Don't you ever want someone who can keep up with you?" Amanda laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, Sophia, don't be mean. He's a great husband, in his own way." Her words were meant to soften the blow, but they only made it worse. I stood up, my face calm but my heart racing. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady. "I need to check on something in the kitchen." As I walked away, their laughter followed me like a shadow. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. I had endured enough. The cracks in my marriage weren't just cracks anymore. They were gaping chasms. And tonight, surrounded by Amanda's friends and their cruelty, I realized something had to change. They thought they could laugh at me, mock me, humiliate me. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. Not yet. As I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, their laughter continued to echo through the house. It wasn't just laughter anymore. It was a reminder. A reminder that somewhere along the way, I had gone from being Amanda's partner to being her punchline. I stared at the rows of hors d'oeuvres Amanda had so meticulously prepared. It all looked perfect, just like the image she loved to project to her friends. But underneath the polished surface, everything felt hollow. It wasn't just the party. It was us, our marriage, our connection. Something had shifted, and I could no longer ignore it. As I leaned against the counter, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Claire, Amanda's quieter friend. She gave me a tentative smile, holding her wine glass in one hand. "Hey," she said softly, "I just needed a breather. It's a bit loud in there." I nodded, gesturing to the wine bottle on the counter. "Refill?" She held out her glass, and I poured, trying to ignore the awkward silence hanging between us. Claire wasn't like the others, at least, not entirely. While Sophia and Rachel thrived on mockery, Claire always seemed uncomfortable when things got too mean-spirited. She was a follower, not a leader, and I often wondered why she stayed friends with them at all. "You okay?" she asked after a moment, her voice hesitant. I raised an eyebrow. "Why wouldn't I be?" She gave a nervous laugh, looking down at her glass. "I don't know. They can be a bit much sometimes." "A bit much?" I repeated, my tone sharper than I intended. "Claire, they've spent the entire night tearing me down, and Amanda hasn't said a word to stop them. In fact, she's encouraged it." Claire flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she took a sip of her wine, her eyes darting toward the living room. "Sophia can be intense," she admitted, "but I don't think Amanda means any harm. She just gets caught up in it." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Caught up in it? Claire, she's the one leading the charge. If this is what she thinks of me, why are we even married?" She didn't have an answer, and after a moment, she mumbled something about needing to check on the others and slipped out of the kitchen. I watched her go, feeling a mix of frustration and resignation. Claire's half-hearted attempt at empathy only reinforced what I already knew. I was on my own in this. I stayed in the kitchen for a while, avoiding the chaos in the living room. But eventually, I couldn't ignore the voices drifting down the hall. "Where's Daniel?" Sophia's voice rang out, loud and mocking. "Did we scare him off?" "Probably hiding," Rachel chimed in, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "He's so sensitive. Poor guy." "Oh, come on," Amanda said, laughing. "He's used to it by now. Aren't you, Daniel?" That was it. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked back into the living room, my expression calm but my mind racing. The laughter stopped as soon as I entered, and all eyes turned to me. Amanda looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected me to confront them. "Enjoying yourselves?" I asked, my tone light but laced with sarcasm. Sophia smirked, raising her glass. "Oh, don't be like that, Daniel. We're just having a little fun." "At my expense," I said, locking eyes with her. Rachel leaned forward, her smile smug. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You're the one who married Amanda. You knew what you were getting into." I looked at Amanda, waiting for her to say something, to defend me, to stop them. But she just sat there, sipping her wine, a faint smile on her lips. "You're right, Rachel," I said finally, my voice steady. "I did know what I was getting into. I just didn't realize it would come to this." The room fell silent. Amanda's smile faded, and for the first time that night, she looked uncomfortable. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone defensive. "It means I've had enough," I said, my gaze sweeping over the group. "Enough of the jokes, the insults, the mockery. You can laugh all you want, but I'm done being the punchline." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "And as for you," I said, pointing at her, "maybe you should take a good look in the mirror before you start tearing other people down. You might not like what you see." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. I had finally said what needed to be said. For the first time in a long time, I had stood up for myself. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The cracks in our marriage had turned into fractures, and I wasn't sure they could ever be repaired. Not after tonight. The morning after the party, the house felt eerily quiet. The wine glasses still sat on the table, the plates of half-eaten hors d'oeuvres were scattered across the counter, and the faint smell of perfume lingered in the air. It was as if the chaos of the night before had left a physical imprint on the house, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I stood in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window, replaying the events of the night in my mind. The laughter, the mocking comments, Amanda's complicity, it all felt like a bad dream. But the worst part was knowing it wasn't. It was my reality, one I could no longer ignore. Amanda appeared in the doorway, looking surprisingly composed. She wore her usual morning robe, her hair slightly disheveled but otherwise perfect. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements casual, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said, her tone light and breezy. I didn't respond, just took another sip of my coffee and kept my eyes on the window. "Are we doing the silent treatment now?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I turned to face her, setting my mug down on the counter. "Do you even realize what happened last night?" She frowned, tilting her head. "What are you talking about?" I let out a bitter laugh. "I'm talking about you and your friends. The way you all tore me apart for hours. The way you sat there and laughed while they humiliated me." Her expression shifted, a mix of defensiveness and annoyance. "Oh, come on, Daniel. You're being dramatic. It was just some harmless fun." "Harmless fun," I repeated, my voice rising. "Amanda, they insulted me, mocked me, and you encouraged it. How is that harmless?" She rolled her eyes, setting her coffee down. "You're overreacting. They didn't mean anything by it. That's just how they are." "And what about you?" I shot back. "Is that just how you are now too? The kind of person who lets her friends mock her husband?" Her face flushed with anger. "Don't turn this around on me. You've been distant for months, Daniel. You barely talk to me, you're always working, and when you're not, you're sitting in silence. What do you expect me to do? Pretend everything's fine?" I stared at her, stunned. "So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your behavior?" "I'm saying you don't make it easy," she snapped. "You've been so boring lately. No excitement, no passion. Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a roommate, not a husband." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the truth was, she wasn't entirely wrong. Things hadn't been the same between us for a long time. But instead of addressing it, I had withdrawn, burying myself in work and avoiding the growing distance between us. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. "You're right," I said finally. "Things haven't been great between us. But instead of talking to me about it, you decided to humiliate me in front of your friends. Do you have any idea how that felt?" Her anger faltered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice softer now. "It just got out of hand." I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words. "That's not good enough, Amanda. You can't keep brushing this off like it doesn't matter." "It does. We do." She didn't respond, just looked down at her coffee, avoiding my gaze. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe she cared, that she understood the damage she'd done, but her silence told me otherwise. After a moment, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there. I needed space, time to think about what came next. Because one thing was clear, something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, in a marriage that felt more like a battleground than a partnership. And if Amanda wasn't willing to fight for us, I wasn't sure I could either. For the first time, I wondered if it was already too late. The rest of the week was a blur of avoidance and tension. Amanda and I hardly spoke, navigating around each other like strangers sharing the same space. When we did exchange words, they were brief and transactional, questions about groceries or reminders about bills. The air between us was heavy, suffocating, and filled with unspoken resentment. I buried myself in work, staying late at the office to avoid going home. I told myself I needed the distraction, But the truth was, I wasn't ready to face the reality of our crumbling marriage. Amanda, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. She spent her evenings scrolling on her phone or chatting with her friends, her laughter ringing out from the living room like a mocking reminder of what I was no longer part of. One evening, I came home to find her sitting on the couch with Sophia. The sight of her made my chest tighten. Sophia's presence was like a slap to the face, a reminder of that night's humiliation. She glanced at me as I walked through the door, her smirk as smug as ever. "Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "So good to see you. We were just talking about you." I dropped my bag by the door, ignoring her tone. Lucky me. Amanda shot me a look, but Sophia just laughed, leaning back against the cushions. "You know, Amanda tells me you've been working late a lot. Busy saving the world, huh?" I didn't respond, walking past them into the kitchen. I could hear their hushed whispers behind me, followed by more laughter. It took everything in me not to turn around and say something, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd twist my words into another joke, another punchline. As I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter, I realized something. This wasn't just about Amanda anymore. It was about how little respect I commanded in my own home. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to become the target of their jokes, the silent observer in my own life? I poured myself a glass of water, the cold liquid doing little to cool the anger simmering inside me. Just as I was about to head upstairs, Amanda walked in, her expression guarded. "What's with the attitude?" she asked, crossing her arms. I set the glass down, turning to face her. "What do you mean?" "You barely said 2 words to Sophia," she said, her tone accusatory. "She's our guest, Daniel. You could at least try to be polite." "Polite?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "Amanda, your guest, was one of the people who humiliated me in my own house less than a week ago. Forgive me if I'm not in the mood to play nice." She rolled her eyes, exasperated. "You're still hung up on that? I told you, it wasn't a big deal." "It was a big deal to me," I snapped. "But of course, you wouldn't understand that, because you've been too busy laughing at my expense." Her face flushed with anger. "You're acting like a child, Daniel. It's not my fault you can't take a joke." The words hit me like a slap, but instead of lashing out, I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between us. "This isn't about taking a joke," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "This is about respect, something you and your friends clearly don't have for me." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. "You want to keep laughing with them? Fine. But don't expect me to stand here and let you treat me like this anymore." With that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there. I could feel her gaze on my back, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. The cracks in our marriage weren't just growing. They were gaping chasms now, impossible to ignore. I thought about our early years together, the way Amanda used to look at me, the way we used to laugh with each other, not at each other. Somewhere along the way, we had lost that connection, and I wasn't sure it was something we could ever get back. As I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept running through my mind. Something had to change. If Amanda wasn't willing to fight for us, I'd have to decide whether I was willing to keep fighting alone. Because this wasn't just about last week's party or Sophia's smug comments. This was about respect, dignity, and whether there was anything left to salvage between us. The weekend came, but instead of bringing relief, it only added to the tension simmering in our home. Amanda had planned another social outing with her friends, and while she didn't explicitly invite me, she left enough hints to make it clear she wanted me there. It felt like a trap, a way to make me part of her world again, not out of love or reconciliation, but out of convenience. I decided to stay home. I wasn't in the mood to be the silent bystander while Amanda paraded her charm and let her friends tear me down again. Instead, I spent the morning cleaning the house, trying to clear my head. But even the mundane act of vacuuming couldn't drown out the echo of their laughter from the last party. It lingered, like a bad memory refusing to fade. Amanda left around noon, dressed to the nines, her perfume trailing behind her as she walked out the door. She didn't say goodbye. I didn't expect her to. The silence in the house was deafening once she was gone. I sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels, unable to focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to our argument in the kitchen, to the way she had brushed off my feelings like they didn't matter. It wasn't just hurtful. It was a reminder of how far we'd drifted apart. Around mid-afternoon, I got a call from Liam, my best friend. Liam had been my rock during these difficult weeks, always ready with a beer and an ear to listen. "How's it going, man?" he asked, his tone casual but concerned. "Same as always," I replied. "Amanda's out with her friends again." Liam sighed. "You know, at some point, you're going to have to ask yourself if this is worth it." I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "you've been bending over backward for years, Daniel. Always putting her first. Always playing the good husband. But what's she doing for you? Where's the respect, the partnership?" I didn't have an answer. Liam continued, his voice firm. "You deserve better, man. If she can't see that, then maybe it's time to stop waiting for her to change." Liam's words stayed with me long after we hung up. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. I had been holding on to the idea of who Amanda used to be, hoping she would magically revert to the woman I had fallen in love with. But the truth was, people change. And sometimes, they change in ways that leave you behind. As evening approached, I decided to go for a walk. The crisp air felt refreshing, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of clarity. I wandered through the park, watching families play with their kids, couples strolling hand in hand, and joggers passing by with their headphones in. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of my own life, and it made me realize just how much I had been neglecting myself. When I returned home, Amanda was already back. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in her hand. She glanced up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. "You were out?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Yeah," I said simply, kicking off my shoes. "Went for a walk." She nodded, looking back at her phone. The lack of engagement stung, but it also confirmed what I had been feeling all day. We were living in two separate worlds, and neither of us seemed willing to bridge the gap. I sat down across from her, the silence stretching between us. Finally, I said, "Amanda, do you even want this to work?" She looked up, surprised. "What are you talking about?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Our marriage. Do you even care anymore?" Her face softened for a moment, but then she shook her head. "Of course I care, Daniel, but things have been hard." "Hard?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Amanda, you've done nothing but push me away. You let your friends mock me, you ignore my feelings, and you expect me to just take it?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "And what about you? You've been distant, cold, and completely uninterested in my life. Don't act like this is all on me." The argument spiraled from there, each of us throwing years of grievances at the other. It was exhausting, painful, and ultimately fruitless. By the time we stopped, we were both emotionally drained, sitting in silence as the weight of our words hung between us. I went to bed that night feeling more certain than ever that something had to change. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a battlefield, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep fighting. The morning after our argument felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that clings to you no matter how much you try to shake it off. Amanda and I didn't speak, moving around each other like strangers sharing the same space. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us louder than anything we could have said. I kept thinking about what Liam had said on the phone the day before. "You deserve better." It echoed in my mind, gnawing at the part of me that still wanted to believe Amanda and I could fix this. But every moment of silence, every dismissive look, every unspoken word felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Amanda spent most of the day texting on her phone, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard not to notice the way she smiled at her screen, the way her expression softened in a way it hadn't for me in years. Around noon, she announced she was heading out to meet her friends again. "Don't wait up," she said casually as she grabbed her purse. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was left alone in the empty house. I decided to call Liam again. I needed his perspective, his no-nonsense approach to life that always managed to cut through the noise in my head. She's out with her friends again, I said, pacing the living room. Let me guess, Liam replied. Sophia and the Mean Girl Brigade? Probably, I muttered. I don't know what to do anymore, man. It feels like she's already checked out of this marriage, but she won't admit it. Liam was quiet for a moment before saying, Look, Daniel, you've got two options here. You can keep waiting for her to come around, or you can take control of the situation. Stop letting her call the shots. What does that even mean? I asked, frustrated. It means you decide what's next, Liam said firmly. Stop reacting to what she does and start thinking about what you want. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life with someone who doesn't respect you? His words hit hard, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. For so long, I had been focused on trying to salvage what was left of our marriage, trying to make Amanda happy, trying to fix something that maybe wasn't fixable. But what about me? What about my happiness, my self-respect? As the day went on, I found myself replaying moments from our relationship, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I thought about the woman Amanda used to be, the one who laughed with me, not at me. I thought about the man I used to be, confident and self-assured, before years of mockery and dismissal had chipped away at my sense of worth. By the time Amanda came home that evening, I had made a decision. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. She walked through the door, her heels clicking against the floor, her face flushed with the glow of wine and laughter. She glanced at me as she set her purse down. You're still up? Yeah, I said, my tone calm but firm. We need to talk. She hesitated, clearly caught off guard by my tone. What's this about? I gestured for her to sit down. She sighed but complied, sitting across from me at the dining table. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I can't do this anymore, Amanda, I said finally. She frowned, her defensiveness kicking in. Do what? This, I said, gesturing between us. The silence, the disrespect, the constant feeling that I'm the only one trying to hold this marriage together. I deserve better than this. And so do you. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shaken. You're serious. I've never been more serious, I said. I love you, Amanda. But love isn't enough if there's no respect, no partnership. And right now, it feels like we've lost both. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something to say. Finally, she whispered, I don't know how we got here. Neither do I admitted. But unless something changes, I don't see how we move forward. The conversation ended there, the weight of my words hanging between us. Amanda went to bed without saying another word, and I stayed up, staring at the blank TV screen, wondering if I had just started the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. It was time to take control of my life again, no matter what that meant. The ambulance lights cast a harsh, flickering glow against the sterile walls of the hospital corridor. I sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair, the cold seeping through my shirt. Amanda paced back and forth in front of me, her heels clicking incessantly on the linoleum floor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, whether from worry or something else, I couldn't tell. How could this happen? She muttered, more to herself than to me. They were fine 1 minute and collapsing the next. I looked up at her, my expression neutral. I'm sure the doctors will figure it out. She shot me a quick, scrutinizing glance. You were in the kitchen most of the night. Did you notice anything unusual? Unusual like what? I asked calmly. She hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know. Never mind. Before I could respond, a doctor approached us, flipping through a chart. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson? We both stood up. Yes, that's us, Amanda said hurriedly. How are they? Your friends are stable now, the doctor assured us. They experienced severe allergic reactions, but we were able to administer treatment in time. Allergic reactions? Amanda repeated, confusion clouding her features. To what? We're running some tests, but initial indications point to exposure to a specific allergen. Shellfish, to be exact. Shellfish? Amanda looked baffled. But none of the dishes had shellfish. And as far as I know, They're not allergic. The doctor nodded. Allergies can develop unexpectedly. Has there been any recent changes in their diets or environments? Amanda glanced at me, then back at the doctor. I don't think so. We all ate the same food, drank the same wine. Why would only they react? That's what we're trying to determine, the doctor said gently. We'll keep you updated as soon as we know more. He walked away, leaving us in a thick silence. Amanda turned to me, her eyes searching. This doesn't make any sense. I shrugged slightly. Sometimes things happen without explanation. She narrowed her eyes. You seem awfully calm about all this. I met her gaze evenly. Would you prefer I panic? She opened her mouth to say something, but was interrupted by the sound of raised voices down the hall. Sophia, Rachel, and Claire were being wheeled out of the emergency room toward private rooms. Despite their weakened states, they seemed agitated. Amanda rushed toward them, and I followed at a slower pace. As we approached, I could hear snippets of their conversation. Don't understand how this happened, Rachel was saying weakly. This is all too convenient, Sophia added, her eyes flickering toward Amanda. Claire looked between them, her expression conflicted. Maybe it was just an accident. Sophia scoffed. An accident that only affects us? Please. Amanda reached them, forcing a smile. I'm so glad you're all okay. I was so worried. Sophia fixed her with a cold stare. Were you? Amanda recoiled slightly. What does that mean? Rachel chimed in, her voice strained. We just find it odd that you insisted on pouring the drinks yourself. And then this happens. I watched the exchange silently, noting the cracks forming in their tight-knit group. Are you implying I had something to do with this? Amanda asked incredulously. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Can you blame us for wondering? Amanda looked over her shoulder at me, confusion and fear mingling in her eyes. I held her gaze, but offered no reaction. Why would I ever harm you? She pleaded. Claire sighed. Maybe not harm, but you've been distant lately. We all noticed it. Rachel nodded. Ever since things with Daniel started getting complicated. Amanda's face paled. This is ridiculous. You're my friends. Friends who mocked my husband in our own home, I said quietly, stepping forward. They all turned to look at me. Sophia's eyes flashed. Oh, so now you're playing the victim? I felt a surge of irritation but kept my voice steady. No, just stating a fact. Amanda put a hand to her forehead. This is getting out of hand. We need to focus on finding out what happened. Sophia leaned back against her pillow, a faint smirk on her lips. Maybe you should look closer to home. Before Amanda could respond, a nurse intervened. I'm sorry, but the patients need to rest now. We stepped back as the nurses guided the beds into individual rooms. Amanda stood there, staring at the closed doors, her shoulders slumped. Let's go, I suggested softly. She turned to me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. They're blaming me, Daniel. My own friends think I did this. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Why do you think that is? She frowned. What are you implying? I met her gaze. I'm not implying anything, but perhaps they don't trust you as much as you thought. She looked away, wrapping her arms around herself. First you, now them. It's like everyone is turning against me. I sighed. Amanda, maybe this is an opportunity to reflect on how we've all been treating each other. She shook her head. I don't need a lecture right now. We walked back to the waiting area in silence. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think I did it? I looked at her, surprised. What? Do you think I had something to do with their reactions? She repeated, her eyes searching mine. I considered her question. Did you? Of course not, she exclaimed. How could you even ask me that? I didn't, I pointed out gently. You asked me. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. This is a nightmare. I sat beside her. Amanda, maybe it's time we both reassess some things. She peeked at me through her fingers. Like what? Like our relationships, I said. With each other and with others. She dropped her hands. You think this is about us? In a way, yes, I admitted. The tension, the mockery, the lack of respect, it's all connected. She sighed deeply. I never wanted any of this. Neither did I agreed. Just then, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and grimaced. It's Vanessa. She's heard about what happened. I nodded. You should probably update her. She stood up. I need some air. As she walked away to take the call, I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The events of the night replayed in my mind. The toasts, the sudden illness, the accusatory glares. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, but another part felt vindicated. When Amanda returned, she looked more composed. Vanessa is on her way, she said quietly. All right. She sat down again, her gaze fixed on the floor. Daniel, I know things have been strained between us. And with the girls. Maybe we all needed a wake-up call. I looked at her thoughtfully. What are you saying? Maybe it's time I distance myself from them, she admitted. And maybe we can work on us. I raised an eyebrow. You think it's that simple? She shook her head. No, but it's a start. I considered her words. Perhaps. As we sat there, side by side yet worlds apart, I realized that the night's chaos might have been the catalyst we needed. Whether it would bring us back together or push us further apart remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The foundations of her friendships and our marriage had been shaken. And whatever happened next would depend on the choices we both made. The ride home from the hospital was painfully silent. Amanda sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I glanced at her every so often, wondering if she was reliving the same scenes I was, the ambulance lights, the accusations, the quiet venom in Sophia's words. I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands clenched and unclenched. She wasn't used to being on the defensive, especially not with her closest friends. They think I did it, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but I could hear the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I kept my eyes on the road. Do they? She turned to me, her expression a mix of hurt and frustration. Don't pretend you didn't hear them. They practically accused me of poisoning them. I sighed. They didn't accuse you outright. They're just questioning things. Questioning things, she snapped. They think I intentionally hurt them. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Maybe now you know how I felt when they humiliated me in front of everyone. Her mouth opened, but she closed it quickly, as if she didn't know how to respond. For once, she didn't have a quick retort or a dismissive laugh. Instead, she leaned back in her seat and stared at the passing streetlights. When we got home, Amanda went straight to the bedroom without a word. I stayed in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey and trying to make sense of the night's events. The accusations, the glares, the mounting tension. It was like watching a house of cards collapse. And while I couldn't ignore the chaos it caused, part of me felt a grim satisfaction. Her friends, so quick to mock me, had turned on each other at the first sign of trouble. It was ironic, really. They'd always acted like they were untouchable, a perfect circle of confidence and camaraderie. But now, their trust was fractured, and Amanda was caught in the crossfire. The next morning, Amanda emerged from the bedroom looking tired but determined. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her. I've been thinking, she said, her tone cautious. I raised an eyebrow. About what? About everything, she replied. About last night, about us, about my friends. I don't know how we got here. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Do you really not know? Or have you just been ignoring it? She flinched at my words but didn't argue. Maybe I have been ignoring it, she admitted. But it's not like I meant for things to get this bad. I didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to, but you did, I said, my voice steady. Amanda, you've been letting your friends mock me for years. And last night, when things went south, they turned on you just as quickly. Don't you see the pattern here? She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. I see it. I don't know how to fix it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a crack in Amanda's armor. The confident, untouchable woman I'd married was now grappling with the reality of her choices. And while part of me wanted to comfort her, another part couldn't forget the years of disrespect, the way she laughed along with her friends at my expense. You need to decide what's important to you, I said finally. Because if this keeps going, there's no coming back from it. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you think it's too late for us? I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I think that depends on what you're willing to do to make things right. Over the next few days, Amanda made an effort to distance herself from her friends. She stopped answering their calls and texts, even when Sophia sent increasingly aggressive messages demanding explanations. I watched as Amanda struggled with the decision, torn between loyalty to the women she'd called friends for years and the realization that they weren't who she thought they were. One evening, as we sat in the living room, she turned to me. It's not easy, you know, letting go of people you've known for so long. I know, I said simply, but sometimes it's necessary. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you think they'll ever forgive me? I looked at her, choosing my words carefully. I think the better question is whether you should want their forgiveness. She frowned but didn't argue. For once, she seemed willing to sit with the discomfort and face the consequences of her actions. The cracks in her friendships were growing deeper, and Amanda was beginning to see the cost of her choices. Whether it was enough to repair the damage between us remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. Together. The fallout from Amanda's crumbling friendships played out like a slow-motion train wreck. Over the following weeks, her once tight-knit group of friends grew more distant. The text messages from Sophia, Rachel, and Claire became fewer, their tone colder. Amanda would sit on the couch, staring at her phone, her face a mask of confusion and frustration. They're acting like I'm the enemy, she muttered one evening, tossing her phone onto the coffee table. I've done so much for them, and now they're just gone. I sipped my tea, watching her carefully. Maybe they weren't the friends you thought they were. She shot me a look, her eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Amanda, your friends thrived on tearing people down, me, each other, anyone who didn't fit their mold. And now that things aren't perfect, they're turning on you. It's what they do. She opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again, looking away. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the realization creeping in. As much as she wanted to defend them, she couldn't deny the truth. The real breaking point came when Amanda ran into Rachel at a cafe. She came home that evening, visibly shaken, and threw her purse onto the counter. Rachel barely even looked at me, she said, her voice trembling. She said they've all been talking and they think I poisoned them on purpose. I stared at her, stunned by the absurdity of it. They actually said that? She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She said I was trying to assert dominance, or some ridiculous thing like that. As if I would ever. I mean, how could they even think that? I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part felt a grim satisfaction. For years, she had chosen these women over me, had laughed with them at my expense, had prioritized their approval above all else. Now, she was finally seeing their true colors. Amanda's isolation grew. Her once busy social calendar was suddenly empty. She stopped hosting parties, stopped dressing up, stopped smiling as much. For the first time, she seemed to understand what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. One night, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think I ever really knew them. I glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. Maybe not. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. I don't know who I am without them. They've been such a big part of my life. I hesitated before responding. Maybe it's time to figure that out. To figure out who you are without anyone else defining you. She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. And us? Do you think we can figure out who we are again? The question hung in the air, heavy with years of unresolved tension. I didn't have an answer, not yet. But as I looked at her, for the first time in a long time, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding. Time would tell. The days that followed were quieter, almost peaceful, but not in the comforting way I'd once hoped for. It was the silence of something ending, or maybe something beginning. Amanda seemed subdued, her once constant whirlwind of energy now replaced with reflection. It was as if she was finally seeing the cracks in her life, the ones she had ignored or papered over for years. And maybe, just maybe, so was I. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, Amanda joined me. She had no phone in hand, no distractions, just her and the faint vulnerability etched into her expression. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she started, her voice quiet but steady. I looked up, surprised but intrigued. "About what?" "About respect. About us," she said, clasping her hands together on the table. "And how I've treated you. How I've let others treat you." I nodded but said nothing, letting her speak. "I can't change what I've done, Daniel," she continued, her voice tinged with regret. "But I want to do better. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've let this version of me take over, someone I'm not proud of." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I could see how hard it was for her to admit, to own up to the damage she'd caused. And while part of me wanted to forgive her, to hope that this was the beginning of something new, another part remained cautious. "What changed?" I asked finally. She hesitated, then sighed. "Losing my friends. As much as it hurt, it made me realize how shallow it all was. The gossip, the mockery, the constant need to prove something to people who didn't even care about me. And I realized I was dragging you into that, making you a target instead of my partner." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "And now?" "Now I want to focus on what matters," she said, meeting my gaze. "On us, if you're willing." Her words were honest, but honesty alone wouldn't fix the years of hurt. Still, for the first time in months, maybe years, I saw a flicker of hope. Not just for her, but for myself. I had spent so long being the silent victim, letting resentment build, that I'd forgotten I had a say in my own happiness. "I'm willing," I said slowly, "but it's not going to be easy. Respect, trust, they take time to rebuild." "I know," she said softly, "and I'm ready to put in the work, if you are." The weeks that followed were far from perfect, but they were a start. Amanda distanced herself from Sophia and the others completely, focusing instead on therapy and rebuilding the life she had nearly destroyed. I joined her in therapy, not just for us, but for myself. I needed to find my voice again, to learn how to stand up for myself without letting bitterness consume me. Slowly, we began to reconnect. We talked more, really talked, about our fears, our mistakes, our hopes. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments, moments of doubt, but each step forward felt like progress. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Amanda reached for my hand. Her touch was tentative, as if asking permission. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked, glancing at her. "For not giving up," she replied, "even when I didn't deserve it." I didn't respond right away, letting her words settle. Finally, I said, "We're not there yet, but we're trying. That's what matters." She nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I thought I'd lost, peace. The road ahead wasn't certain, but for now, we were walking it together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.